Alright, now we'll be reading from 5-Minute Marvel Stories. Miles is a student at Midtown High in New York City. He's happy and he has a thirst for knowledge, especially science. He was a young boy just like any other, hardworking and doing the right thing. But something happened that day that changed his life for good. While in chemistry class, now Miles noticed that his good friend Peter Parker kept sneaking out of school. Miles grew suspicious, wondering if something was wrong with Peter, if he was okay. So one day, Miles followed Peter and watched as he snuck a mask from his bag. But it wasn't just any mask that Peter was sneaking out of his bag. It was Spider-Man's mask. Miles couldn't believe it. When Peter was leaving the school that afternoon, Miles called to Peter, "Hey Peter, where are you headed?" Peter awkwardly smiled back and said, I've got an assignment for the Daily Bugle. I've got to go." Miles didn't believe that either. He followed Peter to a giant laboratory. And inside that lab, Miles lost track of Peter and didn't notice the genetically altered spider slowly spinning a web and dropping down towards him. You see that? Spider coming towards Miles. I can't read upside down, honey. Yow! The spider bit Miles on his hand. Miles knocked it off. He instantly knew that was no ordinary spider bite. Instead of getting sick from the spider bite, Miles soon discovered that it gave him special spider powers. "I've got to figure this out," said Miles. "What does this mean? What should I do?" So he ran back home fast. Think, Miles told himself. If Peter really is Spider-Man, then what would he do? Miles searched for articles about Spider-Man. Okay, so you've got these powers, check. Then what? You make a costume and stop the bad guys. That seems obvious. With that, Miles created his own Spider-Man costume and leapt into the city. Look at that. See, Miles' Spider-Man costume, it's different. It's black, it's got the red spider. It's like backwards Spider-Man. But he's the awesome Spider-Man. He's my favorite out of the two. Not because he's black, but because he's awesome. "I can run on walls," Miles yelled as he scaled the side of the building. He was enjoying discovering his powers, and climbing walls wasn't the only one. Miles soon discovered that he had an amazing spider sense that warned him of any kind of danger. It's like a spider sense. He could feel what's going on around him. Like if there's any danger, if somebody's going to come up from behind him and hit, the spider sense tells him, and then he knows to put his hand up to block the attack. "What the heck, Miles said. He couldn't ignore the ringing in his brain. Yeah, I could imagine. That's when he noticed the burglars running behind him. In that instant, what started off as fun became very scary. Miles had a really big decision to make. Should he run from the danger or stay safe? Or should he use his superpowers to try and stop these villains? Miles realized that he was going to call himself Spider-Man. He was going to have to act like Spider-Man. Much to his surprise, Peter Parker, as the original Spider-Man, was already on the case. One of the criminals was getting away, but Miles was able to help. "Hold on, Helmet Head," he announced. "This is the place you're racing off to. The only place you're racing off to is prison." Miles had his powers to match Peter's and was easily able to contain the thief. See? That's him climbing up the wall. That's him chasing the two bad guys. Looks like they're on motorcycles. They're on motorcycles, and you see, Peter has this bad guy. Miles has that bad guy. They got him. It wasn't until the action was over that Miles realized just how much danger he was really in. He climbed to the top of the building and wanted to fade away, which is exactly what he did. This was a brand new power, one that Peter didn't have. He camouflaged himself into his surroundings. See? He's like disappearing. Because he can make himself invisible. Peter swung up to where Miles had been. "Miles, is that you?" Peter called out. "I recognized your voice. Believe it or not, I know what you're thinking. I went through the same thing when I first got my powers." And Miles was stunned. "You did?" "Sure I did," said Peter. "My Uncle Ben used to tell me that with great power there must also come great responsibility." That's not exactly what he said. He said with great power comes great responsibility or whatever. I don't know. Okay, so Peter tossed Miles something from his costume. "Here, you have these extra web shooters for now," said Peter. "Whoa, cool," Miles said while testing out the web shooters. Miles looked up to Peter, figuring out what he should do. "Maybe I can follow you around for a few days, see how it goes." And if you look, I showed you this one. That's with him disappearing. I don't know if you can really see it. And there's Miles testing out his new web shooters with Peter in the background telling him what to do. "I think that's a good idea, but you just can't go around calling yourself Spider-Man, Miles. That name's taken." "Oh, I'm definitely Spider-Man," Miles said, smiling again. The two swung off together to patrol the friendly neighborhood. It wasn't long before Peter got them into quite the pickle, surrounded by some of the nastiest villains in New York City. And that's when Miles knew. Okay, so there they are swinging. And that's where Miles knew that he was in trouble, because you got Dr. Octopus, got the Green Goblin, well, you got Sandman, and is that Venom, Rhino, there's the Lizard. It's Mysterio's arm, but I don't see Mysterio's head. I see his arm. Okay, so that's when Miles knew he was born for this. Oh man, now look at that. Look at all of them fighting. The Lizard, Sandman, Rhino, Dr. Octopus, the Green Goblin, and Venom. They're fighting. So there's Peter up there helping them. The battle roared while Peter kept poking fun at the rampaging villains. Miles was terrified. "How do you keep joking in the middle of a fight?" he asked Peter. "Aren't you scared?" That's when the Rhino grabbed Peter by the neck. Peter couldn't let out another word, funny or otherwise. Miles turned and let loose his newest and last power. Another power that Peter didn't have at all. Miles would later call it his Venom Strike. And it put Rhino down for the count. Peter was safe. See? There they are fighting Rhino. A Rhino's a guy. He's stuck in that suit. I'll explain him some other time. There's Miles right there with his new web shooters. See? Peter has to make his web shooters for him now. Miles and Peter's wrapped in maybe a little more than the usual amount of sticky stuff. Peter said, "Come on, if you're not going to change your name, you're going to have to learn how to crack jokes. It's part of the job. Give it a try." Miles scratched his head thinking, while only looking down at the webbed up villains. He then said, "Looks like you've got yourselves into a sticky situation, evildoers." Peter laughed. "Wow, somebody call the doctor. You have a funny bone." Okay, and that's the end of that story. Next up, a family affair. And that looks like it's a guardian's tale. But that'll be for next time. Love you, baby girl.